subscribe.
Sometimes when the wind is howling outside my cell, I lie back in my bed with the radio on, hardly listening. My thoughts are miles away in the past. The faces of yesterday come alive to my eyes, and I wonder where some of my old friends have gone, and what they are doing now. I think of how much I would like to have a chat with them, but, alas, it is not to be. Time and distance can be so sad. On Sundays, the hymns on Radio 2 remind me of Wormwood Scrubs, when Ron and I were 16 years of age in the prison church with all the young offenders. I can still see all their faces. Time has taken many of our old friends from us, through death, and we are left with just the memories, and the dreams. Recently, I dreamed I was 23 again. I was in the Regent Canal Dock area of London with my late friend Billy Jones. I woke up, and as I lay in the darkness with my thoughts, I could see the faces before me. Billy Jones, Jim Harris, all friends who are no longer with us. They will not be at the gate to meet me when I get out, but I know they will be there in spirit. My main regret in life is that I wasn't in the company of my parents for long enough. I suppose, like us all, I now realize I took them too much for granted and thought they would be with us forever. Not long ago, I dreamed I was once again in the company of my mother and my Uncle Jack. I suddenly woke to the familiar surroundings of my cell, to my great disappointment and sorrow. "22 years in prison, and I still get flashbacks to the past, to other times and other places which I have enjoyed. It must be some sort of safety valve that works in my sleep to induce good feelings. The memories I most cherish of my late parents are from the days when we all lived together at 178 Valence Road, Bethnal Green, in the East End of London. We had moved there at an early age from Steen Street, Hoxton, less than a mile away, where Ron and I were born on the 24th of October 1933. Number 178 was a lucky old house. It had a big oak door with a large knocker, and the people used to call it Fort Valence, a name which was given to it by a fella called the Curly King. It was a terraced house with a toilet out in the yard. Ron and I used to love the kitchen. We had a big coal fire, and we used to sit around it while our mother used to be doing the ironing or making pots of stew or cups of tea. When we were kids, Ron and I used to sleep in the back room, and sometimes we would lie there in the mornings listening to my mother, Violet, singing Vera Lynn songs. She had a melodious singing voice with good resonance, and as I listened, I used to get great comfort and a feeling of belonging, as though we were in our own mansion and not just a terraced house. My old man, as we referred to my father Charles, was a man of few words, but he had a good personality, and when I would walk into the small kitchen, he would proudly say to me, "Your mother has a good voice, hasn't she? She should have been a singer." And I would nod in agreement while he poured me a cup of tea. He used to keep chickens in the backyard, which we would eventually eat. I remember once a little chick, just a few days old, fell into a bowl of water and appeared to be dead. My old man placed it on a cloth in the oven with the gas on warm, and the bird recovered. Afterwards, it used to follow my father all over the kitchen. The old man always used to have parties in the house, and my mother was always a good hostess. Never once did my parents turn away anyone who had nowhere to sleep or was in need of a meal. All our friends would be welcome, even if they were wanted by the law. I suppose that's why I've always liked plenty of company, and this has helped me in prison, because I'm used to waking up with people around me. Despite what has been written about us in the past, it's not true that Ron ever struck the old man, although there used to be many arguments, just like most families in the East End had in those days. My old man was on the run from the army for 12 years, so he had some excuse to turn to drink, seeing that his family life had been so disrupted. but I never forgot that he went on the run in the first place to look after us when we were young. I have always been proud of him. It was he who first took Ron and me to the Robert Browning Youth Club in South London for boxing lessons. He would take us on a number 8 bus from Bethnal Green to Camberwell 3 times a week to train at the club. He was always immaculate in dress and would go to the barber's every day for a shave. He would also have a bet each day, and his regular haunt for drinking would be the 99 Public House in Liverpool Street. From an early age, Ron and I would both go to the same barber shop, just round the corner from Valence Road. It was called Ben the Barber's by everyone in the neighborhood. Ben was a medium-sized Jewish fella who had jet black hair, pushed right back in the 1920s style. He had a young assistant by the name of Raymond. People would sit patiently on the chairs that were placed at the back of the shop, reading all the magazines and newspapers while they waited for Ben to call out, "Next please." Opposite the chairs where the customers sat for haircuts and shaves were notices advertising things for sale: Gillette blades, Brill cream, and Durex. In those days, Durex were 5 a packet for 2 shillings and 6pence. I used to watch as Ben would quietly slip a packet into a customer's hand as though it were some big secret. Each Saturday the relay radio, everyone used to hire radios in those days, would blare out the football figures and results. Most of the customers were either Arsenal or Spurs supporters. The door of the little shop would be wide open, and all the neighbors, people like Mr. McDougall, Mr. Morton, and Mr. Miller, would call in, "Hello Ben," as they passed by. Ben would please Ron and me by saying how quiet and still we'd been sitting in the chair during the haircut, and we would tell this proudly to our mother when we returned home. After our short back and sides, Ron and I would tip Ben either a 6pence or a shilling, and then go off to our little house up Valence Road. Just as we would leave Ben's shop, we'd see Mr. and Mrs. George Gillett sitting at the doorstep of their house, just at the side of the barber's, having their tea and a chat. Mrs. Gillett would sit on a wooden chair at the side of the street door, which would be held wide open by a large round grey stone placed at its base. The Gilletts had had this stone for years. They were both very tall and broad in build. They had thick grey hair. Mr. Gillett was always in shirt sleeves, with his thick trouser braces showing. The kids nearby would be playing on the cobblestone road, yelling and shouting. They had a game called touch and another called release. Others would be playing football or cricket with a tennis ball. In those days, even the weather seemed better. The sun always seemed to be shining. I can remember my favorite clothes being a grey pair of flannels, a white shirt, and a pair of plimsolls that had been brightened with whitener. Going back further, I can remember when the relay radio man first started to hire out his radios. A lot of the neighbors were suspicious and annoyed with him for getting people into debt. My mother said to me, "It's a shame Mrs. Patch and the other neighbors don't like the relay man much." And I replied, "I wonder why they don't like him. They're good radios. We'll keep ours anyway, eh Mum?" The radios were shaped like a square box. They had 2 dials, one to switch on and one for the 2 different stations. I think my mother used to pay something like 5 shillings a week, and the relay man was responsible for all repairs. She used to keep a card to tick off each week's payment, and if in arrears, she was allowed to pay 2 or 3 weeks' money at a time. In those days, we would get a lot of pleasure from these relay radios in my mother's little kitchen. We used to listen to series such as Dick Barton's Special Agent, Just William, Mrs. Dale's Diary, and family favorites. The first school Ron and I went to was Wood Close in Brick Lane. There was a public house on the corner called the Carpenter's Arms. Little did we know at the time that when we got older, we would buy it. We got on well with all the other kids and teachers at Wood Close School, and at our next one, Daniel Street School, which we moved to at the age of 12. My favorite subject was English, and Ron's was general knowledge. We used to play football and we did boxing for the school, but our early school days were disrupted by the war. We were evacuated to the country for a time. Both Ron and I have loved the countryside ever since, especially Suffolk. In the war years, we stayed at a place called Hadley near Traying, where there were big fields of red poppies and a mansion owned by the Rothschilds. We used to play in the grounds there with the frogs from the ponds and wish that one day we could own a place like that. 25 years later, we did. We bought a mansion and a cottage with 8.5 acres of land in the village of Bildston, Suffolk. Our mother had to sell it when we got arrested. When the war began in 1939, my dad went on the run from the army. He was eventually discharged 12 years later when he and thousands of others received their amnesty from the Queen. Ironically, Ron and I were on the run from the army when Dad received his amnesty. He deserted the army because he had decided it was more important to feed his children, Ron, our elder brother Charlie and me, than it was to serve in the Royal Artillery. Also, he had never worked for a governor in his life. I can remember the local police who would call regularly at Valence Road to try to arrest him for desertion, particularly a sergeant by the name of Malcolm. We called him Humptyback because he had a slight hump. In the early hours of one morning, the police, led by Humptyback, got Ron and me out of bed in our pajamas. They took us downstairs, proceeded to look in the coal cupboard for Dad, and then asked us questions. Ron and I answered, "We have not seen him. Our mother is getting a divorce from him." She had rehearsed this dialogue with us earlier. We were only about 6 or 7 at the time. Ron and I used to hate the police for waking us up in the early hours of the morning. Another time, they looked in the backyard for Dad. He was hidden in the little toilet and one of the coppers went to see if he was there. The copper had his hand on the door when he suddenly changed his mind and said, "I doubt if he would hide in there." Dad used to climb over the back wall to get into the yard of the house next door to Freedom. This house was where my Aunt Rose lived. Sometimes he would then clamber into the yard of the next house where my Aunt May lived, and occasionally he would go as far as the Connors house at the end of the block. Ron and I found this very exciting. Aunt Rose and Aunt May were my mother's sisters. My mother's brother John Lee lived in the cafe he owned on the opposite side of the road. His wife, my Aunt Maud, used to run the cafe. She sold delicious meals and the most wonderful fairy cakes, which she made herself. Transport workers would fill the cafe every day of the week. John also drove a huge coach as part of his occupation. On one occasion, the police called and Dad was unfortunately trapped in the house because they had covered the entrance to my Aunt Rose's. John Lee spotted the situation from across the road and drove his car to the curb at number 178. Dad leapt into the car and John sped away. Another time when the law came, Dad just managed to crawl beneath the sink which was hidden by a curtain trailing to the floor. Once, they caught him and he was sentenced to 9 months in a detention guardhouse somewhere in the West Country. I remember my mother would send money to him, concealed at the bottom of a shredded wheat box which was used to wrap food parcels in. This money Dad would use to buy cigarettes and things. It was, of course, illegal dealing. Another time he was caught and placed in the guardhouse at Woolwich. He escaped to rejoin my mother. At times, the old man would stay at the house of his friend Bob Rolfe, a South London pickpocket and racing man, just past Camberwell Green. My mother would take us to see Dad there and, on these secret trips, we would carry his clean and dirty washing to and fro. It was deep-rooted in Ron and me at a very early age to be rebellious because of the police hounding and searching for my father. But although I have always been anti-authority, through my dad's teachings I have also been a royalist and have never had anything against the upper class. This is because my old man always spoke well of them. He would always say that royalty can't help being born into their way of life no more than we could, and he would go on to say that we were a lot happier than they were. He used to teach us that there's good and bad in everyone, in all walks of life and different nationalities. He was a good man. He was always kind to the old people. He used to come in the pubs and buy all the old people drinks and give them money. We had our differences with him, but we loved him also. When Ron and I would go with the old man on the knocker in the suburbs, buying old clothes door to door, he would always tell us to do two things if the lady of the house answered. First, stand well back from the door so that she would feel comfortable and not afraid, and secondly, always call the lady, madam, in a quiet voice. The old man was considered by most in the old clothes game to be the best in this particular line of work, and the same could be said when he used to go buying gold and silver. He taught Ron and me these trades too, and I used to revel in the learning. During these times, the war was never far away from our daily lives. One morning, Ron and I were asleep at about 8 a.m. in the little upstairs room overlooking the backyard where we slept together in a double bed, when there was a loud bang. We were both slung out of bed onto the bedroom mat. The whole house shook and little things were blown out of place all over the rooms. Black soot blew down from the chimney, and my mother came running into the bedroom and took us both downstairs. My Aunt Rose came from her house at number 176 to see if we were safe, and my Aunt May, from number 174, ran in too. There was a lot of excitement. Everyone was telling each other that a rocket had dropped just underneath the railway arch, halfway down Valence Road, and demolished a complete block of flats with one strike. Many people had been killed instantly while asleep in their beds. I can remember one was a little dwarf who everyone used to like. There were many injured, some trapped beneath the rubble. Rescuers were working with their bare hands in an attempt to free them. Some days later, the Queen, who is now the Queen Mother, visited the scene of the disaster, and Ron and I stood just a few yards from her. She was wearing a pale blue dress and looked really lovely. Another time, I saw a doodlebug in the air over Valence Road. I watched as its engine cut out and it toppled out of the sky and exploded. It made a lot of noise before the engine cut out, and the following silence of this black object in the air was quite sinister and frightening. The wailing of the air raid sirens always had a sense of emergency and danger, but with the doodlebugs and rockets, there was little warning. They just appeared in the skies. I also saw dogfights between Spitfires and Messerschmitts, and a common sight was the air raid balloons, which looked like silver monsters. They reminded me of elephants with their big ears. Though I was just a young kid, I could still see the full drama being played out as though London was a huge stage. The air raid shelter was all very intimate and cozy to me. When the sirens went off, my mother would grab one of my hands and one of Ron's and race us out of the house, followed by Charlie. We would be caught up in the glare of the huge arc lights roaming and searching round the skies. Sometimes the shrapnel would fall down and splatter into the building walls, leaving craters and indentations. We would hunt and find these different shaped pieces of metal the day after the raid, and also the tin foil which lay around in streamers and was used for some sort of radar for the planes. On the corner of Valence Road there used to be a huge lamp post which seemed to me to be a safety point to reach because it was close to the shelter, a railway arch beneath Bethnal Green Junction railway lines. Amidst the air raids, we would also be able to hear the clatter of wheels in motion and trains being shunted into position. To me, all these different noises were like music, the music of London, the sounds of a nation at war. These were days of camaraderie, of closely knit groups of people who were truly at war with the dictator Hitler. In later years, when I had this same type of feeling, I guess we were at war in a way with the establishment. I always considered that drinking and gambling clubs should be legal for the poorer classes as well as for the rich, and it would really needle me that exclusive clubs were run in the West End of London for the rich, while in the poorer areas, these same type of clubs were closed down and said to be illegal. That's another of the reasons why Ron and I were so anti-authority. Anyway, back at the shelter, inside the huge railway arch were other little arches, each one housing a family. My grandfather Jimmy Lee would build a large stage and put on shows for all of us to watch. On one occasion, got on stage and sang to the music of Chocolate Soldier from the USA to loud applause. Another time my grandfather fell off the stage during a singing and dancing act and nearly broke his neck. As is well known, he used to perform his famous white hot poker trick, his walking on bottle tops, and his tap dancing, singing and playing of many instruments in these arches. Each time a train ran on the tracks above us, the shelter would shudder, and I would look up from my little bunk and see the whitewashed ceiling shaking. These stage shows were my first introduction to the theatre, which I grew to love. Years later I went to all the best theatres in London and watched all the great shows. I even went to La Scala in Milan in 1963 to see Madame Butterfly. By day, as kids, we would play games in all the buildings which had been left derelict by the bombs. We also used to play in the cobblestone road of the old London street. My nan's house was right on the corner of this street, and in between playing about, we would pop into her house for a cup of tea and a slice of bread or cake. The door of the terraced house was always open, and the main room had an armchair full of cushions. Heavy velvet curtains hung from the window. There was always a loaf of bread lying on the breadboard with a knife stuck in it, and the teapot would be covered by a woolen tea cozy in pretty colors. Hanging from the ceiling was a long flypaper with flies stuck to the glue, their spindly legs kicking away in their death throes. Ron and I would finish our cup of tea and continue playing in the roadway, pushing a boxcart about. One of us would be sitting in it, steering with a rope tied to the front wheels, while the other would run pushing it from behind. The front of the boxcart would be shaped into a spike so as to damage any other cart that might smash into it. Most of the kids had spikes on their carts. We had an older cousin, Billy Wiltshire, my Aunt Rose's son, who would sometimes give our cart a push with both of us inside it. But if one of the large Truman's Brewery carts came along full of heavy beer barrels, pulled along by 2 or more large Shire horses, our elder cousin would think nothing of pushing us beneath the horse and cart. He was always up to mischief, and when one day I popped my head round the doorway of a bombed building, he slung half a house brick at me, which caught me on the left eyebrow. I had to go to the London hospital at the top of Valence Road in Whitechapel Road to get 6 stitches put in. This cousin Billy would also get me and Ron to take turns at getting into an empty beer barrel while he gleefully pushed us up and down the cobblestone road, which used to give us a good shaking up. But, in a strange way, Ron and I always felt this would make us more hardy, so we would never complain.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please join our Facebook group. It's called Krays Crime Lords of London. We're a friendly moderated group with over 1,000 Kray and other celebrated gangster videos available for view. There's also thousands of images in the photos sections. The link for the group is in the YouTube description section. I hope we see you there soon.
Leave a like and subscribe.
I saw London burning by night, a spectacular sight. St. Paul's Cathedral was lit up in the distance, and the city looked quite glamorous to me in the face of its biggest adversity. There were billows of smoke coming from the burning buildings, and fire brigade ladders were zooming up the buildings to rescue people. I could see firemen at the top of the ladders directing the huge hoses onto the fires. Fire engine bells were clanging all over London, and searchlights were scanning the skies for the planes. It seemed London was fighting to stay alive.